1965, America entered into one of the longest and least successful wars they had ever fought, the Vietnam War. The conflict first arose in 1954 between Communist North Vietnam and capitalist South Vietnam. Still fearing the growing influence of the Soviet Union, America saw it as their duty to assist and protect Allied nations who opposed communism. However, as American involvement in the Vietnam War dragged on through the late 19th century, Americans became increasingly opposed to the war effort. During previous overseas wars, such as World War I and World War II, Americans were enthusiastic to prove their nation's might and spread their nation's ideals around the world. However, the Vietnam War was met with significant civic backlash nationwide, something never seen on this scale until this time. This backlash was largely derived from the rising counterculture and anti-imperialist ideology through the U.S. that questioned the morality of overseas war and marked a turning point in the American perceptions of war as a whole. The Vietnam War marked a turning point in American approval of overseas wars compared to other foreign wars efforts, including World War I and World War II. The principal opposition to the Vietnam War was the counterculture movement, which first arose in the 1960s. In its essence, this was an anti-establishment movement which rejected cultural norms and traditional ways of thinking and behaving, including the concept that war could effectively resolve international disputes. The counterculture movement ran an anti-war campaign which sought to end fighting in Vietnam. This was significantly different from American attitudes about war in previous decades. During World War I and World War II, women and men alike aided on the home front and overseas, and generally possessed positive and nationalistic views towards the war effort. The counterculture movement disagreed that overseas wars were a positive good for the nation, and objected to the imperialistic goals of the U.S.
The use of government propaganda was one of the leading reasons why Americans were so eager to assist the war efforts of World War I and World War II. During the mid-19th century, the U.S. government spread propaganda throughout the nation to promote civilian fear of their enemies. Propaganda usually manifested itself in posters or advertisements. During World War I and World War II in particular, the U.S. government turned out massive amounts of propaganda which portrayed the Japanese, Germans, and Russians as evil monsters with the intent to brutally kill innocent Americans. This created a powerful us versus them mentality for Americans. The U.S. government led their citizens to believe that their lives depended upon supporting the war effort. In this way, Americans were much more devoted to World War I, World War II, and even the Cold War than to the Vietnam War. This is largely because as technology improved over time, so did news media. By the time the Vietnam War rolled around, most Americans had a television set in their home. Because news coverage on the war was more available to the public, Americans could see all the violence and casualties in their living room. This was one of the reasons why there was so much anti-war sentiment. For the first time, Americans could see the full scope of the horror of war. Consequently, Americans saw the tragic conditions Native Vietnamese families and children had to endure. Furthermore, unlike World War I and World War II, Americans could sympathize with the enemy and see that they were not abominations like the government had told them.
Towards the very end of World War II, when the atomic bomb was first created and eventually fielded in Japan, Americans realized the great and terrible power they now held as a nation. Going into the Vietnam War, the terrible concept of being able to utterly annihilate another nation only further led Americans to redefine their morals of overseas war. The differences in technology and military might from the world superpower of the U.S. and the comparatively minute might of Vietnam is nothing less than astronomical. While the U.S. fielded some of the most advanced military technology at the time and one of, if not the mightiest military force of the world, Vietnam had a relatively basic military and fielded almost no heavy armaments that the U.S. could field en masse. This dramatic difference in military might helped fuel questions regarding the morality of war, as well as help fuel the already rising anti-imperialist sentiments already spreading in the U.S. Not only was the dramatic one-sided balance of power a cause for concern for many Americans, but as well as the horrific weapons of war and military tactics fielded by the U.S., the most prominent being widespread use of Vietnam, and a terribly destructive firebomb that left utter devastation wherever it was used, and the realization of the incredible devastation mass bombings had on populated areas that left incredible suffering and ruined the civilian populations. Nixon and Watergate. Another contributing factor to American resistance of the Vietnam War occurred in 1972 with one of the most unforgettable political scandals of American history, Watergate. 5 men were found breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. These men, convicted of stealing documents, were later found to be connected to Nixon's campaign. After this event, America was thrown into political turmoil and distrust. It was a critical factor which affected the response of Americans to the Vietnam War. For the first time, many Americans lost hope and trust in their government. The scandal made many Americans question whether the actions of the American government were really in the best interest of the people. In particular, Americans questioned the government's war agenda and the goals they sought to achieve. All in all, it led to the distrust of the American government that led American disdain of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
During the 1940s and 50s, communism was a largely feared rising power. This era gave birth to the Red Scare, which was a strongly rivalry between the Soviet Union and America that led into the Cold War. Due to the ferocity of this rivalry, the American government sought to portray communism as a complete and absolute evil. As a result, politicians like Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and others would have been seen as symbols of complete evil by Americans. On the other hand, when Ho Chi Minh rose to power in Vietnam in the late 19th century, Americans began to see more gray area in the regards to communism rather than in simple extremes. Due to the increased presence of news media and falling presence of governmental propaganda, Americans could see Ho Chi Minh's motives and could form opinions of their own, rather than being told what to think by the government. For this reason, communism was seen as a greater threat in the mid-19th century than it was during the 1970s. The Battle of Vietnam was a whole new breed of war that America had yet to see in their history. America faced record-breaking amounts of civic protest as well as great amounts of military desertion of soldiers who had been physically and mentally broken by the war. America in the war began to seem less morally sound as the fighting continued, and increasingly Americans saw the war on communism as an excuse for the American government to imperialize less dominant nations. America had fought immoral wars before. The Mexican-American War was fought in the aim of taking land from Mexico by force. However, the Vietnam was different because televisions and news media brought the immorality of war up close and personal to American citizens. For perhaps the first time in history, America's eyes were open to the truth, the violence, and the immorality of war. Americans were able to think independently without being spoon-fed patriotic messages by the government on a large scale than ever before.